welcome back to the Through the Briars podcast. This is episode 4. I am your host, Christian Kosovis. It is good to be back. So today I have a pretty interesting episode that I've been really excited to do actually for a long time since I thought of all of this up. And that is to discuss the power and importance of Gothic literature and melancholy. I'm going to be touching on Edgar Allan Poe's story, which is The Imp of the Perverse, and it is one that isn't as well known as the rest of his poems and short stories, but I think it's one of his most powerful and one that definitely has had the most effect on me that I think is worth talking about. So I'll get into quickly the plot of this. If you don't want to be spoiled, I'm sorry, I'm about to give you basically a rundown of what happens in the book. And it is only like a 15 or so page story. Might be a bit more, might be a bit less. I'm not too sure, but it's very short. So it's a very quick read. And this is just a basic skim. The actual story is very, very in depth, despite the length. You know, Edgar Allan Poe is a master of his craft, and he uses such rich symbolic language, which I'm going to get into later. But just to start with the story of the Imp of the Perverse. Now, his most famous tale that he has is The Telltale Heart. Most of you probably know that story if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe. It's a great story, but The Telltale Heart and The Imp of the Perverse basically run the exact same storyline, except I think The Imp of the Perverse is a little bit more relatable in a certain sense, and I'll explain why in a minute. So essentially there is the main character, which is just the narrator because we don't know his name. And Poe identifies this idea that the imp of the perverse is the feeling where you're tempted by a forbidden thrill. So for example, what that means is I feel tempted to go and do something I know I shouldn't because I know it's wrong. And that temptation is what's most alluring. So he really talks about that idea as the imp of the perverse. And he talks about it at the start of his book as the man standing on the precipice of the abyss, which the precipice is a cliff. And looking down into that abyss, it makes the narrator feel dizzy because he is so tempted by that temptation of, like, would I jump in? Metaphorically. Would I jump in literally? And it's that thrill of like, you should do it. You know that voice, we all have it in different circumstances. Just a quick one. If you've ever had that thought when you're driving on the road and there's an oncoming car, or you're going over a bridge and you're like, I wonder what would happen if I just swerve off the edge or swerve into that truck, which is a bit grim, I know, but that's essentially what this idea is in a nutshell. So after that, the narrator decides to go and he loses the battle and the control to this thrill, to the imp of the perverse. And what he goes and does is he goes and murders this person that's in a hospital. While doing that murder, he gets away with it very cleanly. There is no trace. No one has any possible way of tracking it back to him. And we see this story plot in many other books, notably Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which is another masterpiece, but also in The Telltale Heart, where he murders his neighbor and no one knows. He gets away with it. There's so many books that talk about that. And it's very particular because the getting away with it, I think, is an important part, which I'll attend to in a minute. But after that, the people find the person that he kills dead, obviously, and they declare the death by visitation of God. And what that's trying to allude to as well is that the death, he's so clean from it. He's so out of it that the death looked natural by the visitation of God. So basically his time was up and it was time for him to go, even though he was murdered, right? So in that already tells you that logically, for example, the narrator, he's safe. He's committed the crime. Like, there is no possible way he could be caught. There's no way it could be traced back to him. So if you were to think of something like this from a purely logical and rational point, which a lot of people orient their lives in that kind of way, purely on the logical and the rational, there would be no problem. I mean, he got away with the murder, so that's fine. Like, what now? The funny thing is, though, moments later, he's walking down the street and he starts getting that wave of grief and guilt, exactly like what happened with Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, and exactly what happened with the other narrator in The Telltale Heart. By the way, you should read both The Telltale Heart and The Imp of the Perverse. But the thing that I find really interesting about The Imp of the Perverse is, like The Telltale Heart, he starts feeling like he can hear the words and the breath of the person that he's murdered. He hears voices, he hears laughter, and he turns back and there's nobody there. And to the people walking by, they think he's nuts and he's a schizo because he's just freaking out everywhere and he's scared of his own shadow, essentially. And that's to show you that you can't escape guilt, especially when you've committed sin. And this is a special type of guilt because it's a guilt where you're consciously aware of a great atrocity that you've done, chosen to ignore it, knew there was going to be consequences, but now you're facing the consequences of the sin, but you're also facing the consequences of your own ignorance and your own folly, which is a different kind of suffering. And essentially, later, after he's had his little crazy episode, he gets this feeling that something is tapping him on the back of the shoulder and laughing at him, right? And of course, again, he turns around, there's nothing there. And this is obviously to represent metaphorically and psychologically his psyche that's going insane because, well, he committed murder and the guilt is washing over him. And he thought he was above it. He wanted to do the forbidden thrill. He wanted to play with the imp of the perverse and thought that he could be above morality and get away with the murder and be unflinched. But just like every single other story, he is swept up by that guilt and that trauma. And what I found really interesting when I read that for the first time, it says that he felt that tapping feeling, like something was tapping at him and laughing. And I just thought straight away, an imp also in literature and myth and folklore, an imp is a very small demon, and an imp is really useless. Normally in a lot of archaic talk and shows and stuff, if someone calls another person an imp, it's really just a small, annoying little thing that kind of just doesn't go away. And I found it really interesting because an imp and a trickster is a really powerful symbol as well. And it's another symbol that's endured across a millennia. It's across so long that culture and society in the world is so fond of and continues to carry and use it as an example. So in this, I thought to myself, hey, he's being tempted by the consequence of the imp of the perverse and the literal imp. So what I like to thought of, because a lot of people, when we refer to sin or we refer to temptation, we like to think of demons tempting us. And I think that's right in one sense and another. But for the sake of this, for the context of this story specifically, I think that imp, that trickster spirit, that demon that was tempting him and saying, hey, commit this murder, like you're not greater than the forbidden thrill, like what's there to lose? It's the exact same story, by the way, with the fall out of the garden when Adam and Eve were tempted and Eve bit into the apple. She wanted partly to experience that forbidden thrill of like, why can't I do something because it's wrong? Or it's like, imagine getting to do this because it's wrong, sort of thing. That's partly a thing, but it's a good correlation symbolically there. And in that transformation, the demon of temptation manifests itself, and he goes along with the murder. So he goes along with that murder. And that same demon, after having won him over, is now pulling the strings and is saying, hey, you thought you could outlive this. Look at me, I'm pulling the strings. You're still stuck here, by the way. You're tempted and you're suffering now, and I'm laughing at you. And to further bully and to further deplete the psychological state of the narrator's mind, the demon then is literally there, tapping him on the shoulder. He invited such a dark spirit to take hold of his life to commit that atrocity, to go out to murder, because you don't just get up and go and murder someone unless, in a way, some dark spirit just has a hold of you in some way, or you've let some dark orientation take hold of you. It's got him, and it's telling him, hey, you killed that guy, you're suffering, look at you look crazy. And he's tapping him on the back. And sure, the narrator turns around and he can't see it. And yes, it is a reference also to just the psychological state of his guilt and his consciousness playing with him. But it's like, that imp is there, and it's taunting him, and it's laughing at him. Something as impotent and as useless as an imp, that imp trickster spirit, has found a use out of somebody, and it's to further torment them than what they already had done to themselves. And it's so profound. It's incredible. Honestly, I encourage you to read it if you haven't read it. Again, I can't remember quite how many pages, but it's not long at all. You can read it in one sitting. It's very easy, very rich. Which moves me on to what I'm going to talk about next, which is the power and the importance of Gothic literature. Now, this is one of many increasingly and abundantly beautiful Gothic tales and stories. I think the theme of, when someone hears goth, I think they just think people who dress up with the black and the eyeliner and the makeup and the dark clothes, and they're emo and depressed and kind of like evil darkness, like almost satanic sort of in a sense. But I think the original understanding and definition of Gothic is to do with themes like grief and guilt, and yes, some darkness as well, but not darkness in the evil and horrific sense that we know, while partly it being that, but the darkness that we refuse to face and the darkness that reveals truth. And it reveals truth mostly by forcing you open and cracking open your soul and saying like, hey, I'm right here. This is something you need to accept and see, which is exactly what happened in the Imp of the Perverse, by the way. That darkness and that imp was like, you're an idiot. You let me play you. But now your soul is going to be crying out, and it's being forced to recognize it. You just committed murder on some guy. And you thought that you would get away with it, but you haven't. And there are many other stories, as I said before, like Edgar Allan Poe's Unreal was probably the best purveyor of Gothic fiction and just a prolific writer of that century. He has so many stories. The Fall of the House of Usher, and he does mostly short stories and poems. Like most of his things, you can go and read, and you'll be able to read it in one sitting, or two if you're a really slow and small reader. But another one, for example, The Raven. This is his most iconic poem, and it's a long-winded series of poems essentially. But what he likes to talk about in that is the main person whose wife died, Eleanor, is haunting him, but he doesn't know it. And not Eleanor herself, but the death of Eleanor is haunting him. And outside his porch, there is a raven, and it's constantly there, and it's cawing? When ravens caw? Yeah, it's a really weird word to say. When ravens are cawing at his door, it's also supposed to be a symbolic reminder that, well, firstly, ravens are harbingers of death. They are omen and prophetic creatures. They thrive in places of, not in places of abundance, in places lack thereof. And they're also companions of grief and understanding. And it's really good. Obviously, a raven fits the Gothic theme and aesthetic as well, which I absolutely love. But ravens are such a powerful tool and animal and symbolic creature that the raven, when it's crying out and it's making its raven sounds, it's the exact same sound over and over. And a big part of the raven story is that the raven is telling him one word, one phrase, one sound on repeat constantly, and that it's Elena is dead, or Eleanor, and she's not coming back. And it's that constant reminder that the narrator refuses to accept, but that raven is forcefully bringing upon him to try crack open his soul, so that he forces himself to accept the fact that Eleanor is with the angels, she's not coming back. And that is part of what that raven is trying to symbolize, which I think is brilliant. And there's so many other parts in that poem as well. Edgar Allan Poe, part of the other reason why I like him, he's a very symbolic writer, and he writes with a lot of myth and a lot of symbols and tragedy, and it's great. It's really hard to understand. He uses some incredibly sophisticated language, and if you go over it too fast, it's just straight over your head. It can be quite hard to understand, and there's certainly a lot of times where I had to go over multiple times and look at some analysis and talk with other people to try and work out and discuss what it means exactly. But it's incredible. And I think we've lost that as well as a society, that ability for that creative kind of understanding and that way of speak. We're so brain rotted, and especially me too. I do use a little bit of brain rot, but that way of being and that way of writing and expressing, communicating, it is a big part of the Gothic literature, because Gothic literature is so heavy on symbolism and what those symbols are representing, which is part of the reason why I love it. And when I would write a lot, and when I do write now, and I try to write in that sort of way that is very metaphorical and Gothic and symbolic, because it's so powerful, and you don't need to understand it, but humans, since the dawn of time, we understand symbols, and we look at the world through stories and symbols because we feel it and it moves something in us. You know, Carl Jung spoke about this too. There's all these symbols that man understands inside, and we connect with, and we look at certain things, whether that might be like a circle or fire or a certain number or a certain type of archetypal theme or a castle or a raven or whatever it might be. And we see that, and it touches something inside of us, and because we feel things greater than we understand them most of the time. And that is, that's why it's so profound, and that's why I love it. And part of the Gothic as well is the theme of melancholy and sadness and grief. And melancholy, the definition for those who don't know, is just an extreme state of sadness, which, yes, melancholy is, but I think one part of melancholy that we don't understand and we refuse to account for is that, or maybe some people just don't know, but this took me a long time, because I always wondered to myself, I'm like, why am I always so drawn to this theme specifically? Why do I feel more at peace and whole in myself when I'm feeling that sense of melancholy, or when I'm outside and I see ravens flying around in the gloom of autumn and winter? That rain, when I see and read Gothic literature and fiction and fantasy, why those specific themes draw me so much. And it's because melancholy as well it's a state of being oriented towards depth. And yes, it is sadness too, but I think it's a dual meaning word. And it's oriented to depth because suffering is formative and not just tragic. And that's a really important distinction. You can have that feeling of melancholy and be sad over useless things and be in a state of sadness where it's damaging to one's soul, but you can also be in a state of melancholy where it's a lens, like I was saying before, that raven in the raven, it cracks open your soul and forces you to accept what's right in front of you, forces you to accept that darkness itself is not evil and is not bad. Nothing is inherently evil, but it is the perversion and the twist of that is. And I think so often too, when we see and think of those things like rain or darkness or castles or ruins or cemeteries, it's viewed in a very negative connotation, which is wrong. Because again, like I just said, these things all carry beauty. Dostoevsky said himself, beauty will save the world. And he's right, because we live for that kind of stuff. And all of us, like I said before, different kind of symbols and things. But since the dawn of time, humans understood symbols and stories before language and data and calculation and all this thing. And that's not to discredit and hate on that type of thinking. That is extremely important, and we wouldn't have progressed to the degree that we have without it. But symbols and myth and tragedy and story and all of these things, they are essential to the core of our being and our consciousness, because that's how we understand, and that's how we have moved through the world since the dawn of time. All these stories, they carry over culturally for years, because we understand that instinctively as people. Certain symbols, what they mean, what they represent, colors. Brands, when they make logos for their companies, they're all symbols that we recognize and we understand. And there is incredible power in that. And I think for me is what part of the reason why I'm drawn to that Gothic and that symbolic state is that this took me so long to figure out, by the way. I've been writing for so long to try and figure out what it is and why I feel like I can't seem to understand it, and why perhaps others couldn't understand it in me and I didn't feel seen in a sense. But it's because I think very symbolically too, rather than mechanically. And I think that's helped me so much in my orientation for life and the appreciation of beauty. Because exactly like Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world. And there is absolutely no denying that. You know, that's why I like to talk about these things, art and literature and myth and tragedy and whatever, because the power that they hold allows you to wrestle with the potential of being and with the understanding of consciousness. The emotional intensity of the symbols and of these Gothic themes, they force you to accept what is happening. They force you to feel it. And again, back to the story, it's the same thing. Like that psychological feeling that was tempting the narrator and the perverse, that was the melancholy, so to speak. He was dipped into grief and guilt in that state of melancholy and sadness, but it was a sadness that revealed depth. And that depth that was revealed allowed him to be forced to recognize what he had done that was wrong, and said, hey, this is not okay what you just did. You just murdered some poor person for no reason, because you wanted to feel that you wanted to feel that forbidden thrill. And now you're a mess. You know, it's mind-boggling, honestly, and I don't really like this modern shallow kind of rationalism where it's like it's just this. And I think a flaw, and this is probably going to sound like an unpopular take, but I think thousands of years of just people would attest to this as well, is that you can't live your life orienting yourself in just that one way. You need to be a diverse person as well, but you also need to understand the relevance and the understanding of symbolism and art and myth and truth. Like, these aren't just things. I mean, it's like people that will clown on others for going to university or college to study some kind of artistic degree, when it's like the clothes you wear, the things you love and feel drawn by. You travel to go see buildings that are beautifully crafted from the ancient times of the world. Music, whatever it may be, you go to a museum. All those things are what connect us as people and what unite people. And it's not that with the melancholy and the Gothic themes that you're fascinated by darkness itself. And this darkness I talk about is just evil darkness, so perverted darkness, because darkness is natural and it is a part of our world. I'm fascinated by what darkness reveals. And that is a very big distinction, because for me, and I assume for most people who haven't been able to sort of rectify that and understand it for themselves, is that melancholy is not despair in this sense. Yes, melancholy is a deep state of sorrow, but it's an atmosphere where truth, beauty, and responsibility, they become visible, and you see that and you're like, okay, I know what I have to do now. It's like when you're suffering and you're in a deep, sad state for a long time, but that reveals something about you. And that revelation allows you to change and transform your life for the better going forwards. That is good suffering. And that is the suffering that heals and changes a person, despite how it may look. Because almost every time we look back on it, we say, I needed that, even though it wasn't comfortable and fun in the moment. For me, I understood and I knew quite early on that this is going to sound, it might sound a bit strange for those who can't really understand, don't have this similar sort of perception and lens on this kind of thing. And that's fine. Again, not everyone is drawn to art and all of this kind of literature and myth, and that's fine. But I think we all have the propensity for it and the capacity for it. And if you can develop that perception like a skill, your life will improve dramatically. And not that this is the be-all and end-all of life. Of course it's not. But it's a piece that's missing as we've gotten more onto modern rationalism and that sort of postmodern kind of view. For me, melancholy is the color palette that my soul paints with. And that might sound kind of funky when you first hear it, but the things that I appreciate and like, and the kind of themes that I like, and all of this, and the importance of it. And when you watch a movie or read a book and you see the character and you see the themes and you understand how it all connects and it leads to why they act the way they do, and why people in real life who go through those exact same things operate and orient themselves in the way that the suffered characters do, it's right there. Your soul understands. We understand that subconsciously, all of us. Yeah, there's a lot of quotes, and I have a few just here on my notes, but the beauty of melancholy is something so real and so true. When I'm sitting and I'm writing at nighttime and it's raining, that the sound of that rain is really soothing, not only because we know by science that the sound of rain naturally has a calming effect on the body, but there's something so beautiful and true. It's like the rain in a way, and I'm trying to word this in a way that would make sense for people who don't think with this kind of perception. For some of us, or for some people, the rain is a form of comfort because nature empathizes and sheds tears alongside the brokenhearted. Some other Gothic symbols and themes are castles, ruins. Ruins are a big one. And ruins, when you see them, there's plenty of ruins around the world. You can go to many places and find remnants of ruins. Ruins, they reveal the beauty and terror because in that decay is also a big theme. Decay, destruction, reveal that every beautiful thing does not last. And that is why it's beautiful. And that's why we take things for granted in real life, is because we forget that things are limited and finite. And so are we, and so are people. And the beauty is in the temporary of that experience with them. And that also reflects, ironically and paradoxically, the beauty of the infinite and those that are eternal. Those ruins, you go up and you see them and you think, wow, what once was? What was standing here? This castle, and now it's remnants of that same castle, and it reveals that beauty. Cathedrals, castles, those spires, they have the really pointy roofs. If you search up Gothic architecture, it's all over the world, and I think it's a beautiful form of architecture. Those cathedrals, they have gargoyles on them, and there's a whole symbolic thing with gargoyles too, that not only they derive from some Latin word that I can't remember what it is, but gargoyles essentially were used to help flush out rainwater. They were used as pipes, basically, very artistic pipes, because so the rainwater wouldn't erode the walls and ruin them. But they were also symbolically used as spiritual watchdogs and I'm not saying that I believe this, obviously, but it's just really interesting to look at it from the symbolic lens, is that they're used to supposedly ward off evil spirits, and that's why they're there, and they're a protector of the sacred in the church or the cathedral or the castle or whatever it may be. And people would say in myth and in story that, they would come to life and float around and they would hunt after evil to ward it away from what's sacred. And obviously that's not the case, but it's a really beautiful thing to understand. And I think being able to separate, like, that's not real, but there's some really good truth and some really cool understanding and symbolic meaning that I can draw from that. It's incredibly helpful for your development and just as a person of culture and art and understanding. Even graveyards. A graveyard, it reminds you that you're going to join those people one day, and going into a graveyard, it should be a reminder to act and live your life with humility and to value what's important and not to worship vain things. Because there are people in those graveyards who are poor, who are rich, who are kings, soldiers, professionals. They were people who were altering history for the better, and they're remembered for their courage of character and their valiance and their nobility and the love that they left behind onto the people around them, the impact and the touch that they had on those people. They were not remembered by every last cent they had in their bank accounts or gold that they had in their castles, whatever it may be. They were not remembered for their titles, although we remember, of course, some famous people and stuff by their titles, like this person was a king or a singer or an actor or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, those things are futile. And I have a coin in my room that I carry with me everywhere. And I should have it here to show you, but it's a coin, and on both sides it has two things. But the one side that's more important with those who are familiar with Gothic literature and fiction says Memento mori, which is Latin for remember you will die. And it sounds grim and kind of like, that's a bit dark and whatever, but it's actually not. And it's not a symbol of evil, but it's a reminder again to live with humility. And that skull, it should point to you and show you that the only thing that will remain of you physically is your skeleton. And that's something that's sacred and eternal and divine because it endures. But it's not just that. It's every time I feel like I'm getting out of hand with thoughts or with certain things, I try to look at that and remind myself that to value the beauty in the temporary, to find the terror in the beauty, to look at the world with humility and to try and treat others the best and serve in a way that impacts the future community and doesn't benefit me. Because I'm going to do things that benefit me and then I'm going to be dust in the ground. Whereas if I work for the betterment of the community and the people around me, then eternally I will live on in a sense and be an immortal muse. And that's because I've put myself to something greater. And this is a good distinction is Moses from the Bible, from the Old Testament. Moses paved the way, but he never entered the promised land. And that's a form of martyrdom and sacrifice and responsibility because he led the Israelites out of slavery and all this other stuff. He was dealing with people who were complaining all the time, who were rebellious, who weren't grateful. And we all can have some understanding and experience of that where we do things for people who are ungrateful. But what we have to remember is that he paved the way for a better future and for the future civilizations beyond that. He was the catalyzing force. And there you go. He never got to enter the promised land himself. He never got to be part of the end result, but he was the person who did that for the betterment of the community. And that is a fulfilling life. That is a life of martyrdom and love and power and beauty. And it's absolutely incredible. Just touching on the ravens quickly, not to draw this out for too long, but even in the Old Testament of the Bible, the prophet Elijah, when he was sent to the desert to hide, and he was alone and hungry and forced into a life of monasticism, in the Old Testament, things were worked differently, as people who have read it know. But something that I find really interesting is that because in that there were animals and things that were considered unclean or unholy, but that's not the case, because what happens with Elijah is that God sends ravens to Elijah to bring him food and to sustain his life. And what that's trying to represent also is that normally in the Bible, when things are revealed with divine light and revelation, it's in the form usually of a dove or light or something that's obviously holy, right? A raven is a scavenger. It lurks in deserted places. Like I was saying before, it's a harbinger of grief. But God chose the raven to show that God's providence still endures and was still with Elijah in those moments. But he did it, and he sent the ravens because he was trying to say that I'm still here, but not in a way that's obviously holy, which blew my mind the first time I understood it like that. You know, those and it's so interesting that he chose the ravens too, because Elijah dealt with a lot and was depressed, and he understood that regardless of that, God was with him. And having the ravens go is really funny, because ravens lurk around graveyards and around the dead and the passed on and those who are suffering. And the fact that a raven specifically went to comfort Elijah was absolutely stunning, and just a master move of literary interpretation. It still blows my mind when I think about that, because you know, it's funny as well. Occasionally, if I'm sitting outside and I'm reading or whatever it may be, I see we have a few ravens near mine where they come to me, and we usually feed them, and they come quite frequently at the same time every day, and they sit around and kind of just look and stare. But they've gotten quite close a few times in touching distance, and occasionally when I've been reading, or if I've had a really bad day, more of them come, and it's like they understand. And I can't explain it, but it's a feeling. And ravens are extremely smart animals, by the way. They have the IQ equivalence to that of a 7-year-old child, which is unbelievable, by the way. They're incredibly intelligent animals and loyal companions. And it felt comforting in a sense that they were there. And I don't mean that in a really corny kind of way, but it's like they understood and they knew, and they bow their heads sort of in reverence, I suppose, in a way of understanding and acknowledgement. And to think of that way, like it was with Elijah, where God's providence was still there despite the suffering, it's a really hopeful message, and a really strong and powerful one, literarily, metaphorically, symbolically, psychologically, the whole lot. It's incredible. It's amazing. What I want to touch on just quickly before I wrap this up, this is a whole topic and thing of life where I could never exhaust the topic of Gothic literature, the stories, and melancholy and the meaning. It's unbelievable. There'll definitely be more episodes on this kind of thing and themes specifically in certain books and certain artistic motifs and all of that. But I have a few quotes here that I want to go over, that I want to touch on further bolstering this view. Is that one of them, I can't remember who wrote it. I feel like it may have been Edgar Allan Poe, but it might have been potentially somebody, maybe John Keats. I feel like it might have been John Keats. I could be wrong, but it's melancholy is thus the most legitimate of all the poetical tones. And that's freaky. I mean, you have people even back then knowing this stuff that is not talked about today. That melancholy and that orientation to depth and appreciation for beauty and understanding and wanting to do the right thing, even though you're being torn with moral ambiguity and you're being pulled left and right with temptation and darkness, and you know you're constantly falling into that, but you still want to get up and restrain yourself and control and try and orient yourself in the right way despite that suffering. All of these things, it's the strongest poetical tone, as this says, because in book and in movie and in writing, when we're in that state of melancholy, we're open to the greatest form of change and expression. And that's why when we listen to sad music or sad songs or whatever, we understand it and we feel so seen and heard, because that person was in that melancholic state, that state of sadness, but that state of deep understanding and perception. Another one, melancholy is the happiness of being sad. This may have been Lord Byron who said that. And these people, Lord Byron, John Keats, they have incredible books there. They're romantic literary writers, but also have lots of Gothic and mythic themes, which are incredibly mind-boggling. I'm pretty sure John Keats I think it's John Keats. I get all the people mixed up, but he has an astounding ode that he wrote, and he has a few of them, but it's one of his most popular works, but for good reason. It's amazing. It's called Ode to Melancholy. And it's a pretty short poem, maybe like half a page long, 1 page long. It's amazing, and it talks about all of this stuff, and you see the language that they use and the way they describe it. It's amazing. It's amazing. Another one is, I think this one is from Carl Jung. It's the pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. And that's staggeringly brilliant. The pendulum of the mind, we're constantly in a state of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Now, I do believe we're also in a constant state of what's right versus what's wrong. So that last bit, yes, but we're in a state of, we want understanding what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And often the things that we can't make sense of are in this other realm of perception. And people that forcibly blind themselves off to that are not only putting themselves at an incredible disadvantage towards life, but they're harming their own development, and they're making their life harder and forcibly imposing more suffering on themselves. Because, for example, back to the Imp of the Perverse for a minute. The Imp of the Perverse, at the beginning, and in Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov and the Telltale Heart, they get away with the murder, and somebody who is only logically minded and operates only through rationalism says to themselves, well, I got away with the murder. Logic tells you you're safe. You got away with the murder. It's the same thing with Hamlet. Shakespeare, who's also a great writer because he writes with melancholy and madness and tragedy and symbolic myth and all that's so powerful. But back to the Imp of the Perverse, if he was only logically and rationally minded, he would say, well, I got away with the murder, therefore, I'm fine. What would I need to be guilty over? Except the fact that the guilt still overpowers and his conscience still takes hold and says, dude, you murdered somebody in a hospital. Someone who was already suffering. They're dead. You thought you could rise above because you thought you were above morality because of this way of thinking, this logic and this rationality, which so many of these writers, even Nietzsche himself, Nietzsche was a prolific philosopher. Everyone knows who Nietzsche is, and he wasn't a very super religious person or anything, but he still, despite that, understood the necessity for morality. And although he wasn't very fond of Christianity, for example, he still understood the power of art and myth and all of these things and why they were important. And his statement, God is dead, when you read that, people think that he's sort of like the father of nihilism, which is actually wrong, because he states that when people and societies delve and fall into this state where they're logically and rationally minded, and they reject and they accept morality, but they reject the fundamental basis of that, which is God, they will suffer and things will go terribly wrong. And he couldn't be more right about that. And again, everyone's allowed to their own opinion. There will be people, obviously, who are going to disagree with that. But I mean, even somebody like Nietzsche, who wasn't religious by any means whatsoever, he still understood, and he had that capacity for perception. And I mean, he couldn't have said it better. People will try and shift morality and make it their own and think they can rise above it purely with logic and rationale, except for the fact that even if they don't know it, and despite what they say and do, they can never fully make their own morality because they are still always leaning on the corpse of God, so to speak. I mean, again, that Nietzsche, absolutely brilliant. But the point of what I'm trying to say is, Logic said to the narrator and to Raskolnikov, you got away with the murder. Literally, what are you stressing for? But what it didn't explain, and what it couldn't explain or override, was the guilt, the melancholy that settled in and said, you have blood on your hands, that you can wash your hands, but that blood is still there. You'll never be able to wash that away. You are a murderer. And that, I mean, that's a hell of a thing to think about. You know, the fact that your grief and all of that can be so overpowering, and the fact that it forces your soul to be cracked open and to confront the darkness and morality and consciousness and all these things. It's mind-boggling. And when you read these stories, again, they're lessons, and we understand the world through a story and symbols, and we say, hey, maybe we shouldn't murder people. This is a great lesson. It says we shouldn't murder people, not because it's wrong as well, but also because your body will reject that decision, and you'll be forced into that state of extreme guilt and depression for the average person. This is not counting sociopaths who obviously have mental conditions and kill without remorse. This is the average Joe. But this is what these stories do, and this is why all the Gothic stories are so profound and strong. Shakespeare has Gothic stories. Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley. All of these people, incredible. You have to get your hands on Gothic literature, and I want to put out a book list of books that I recommend for people to read. But if you can remember one thing, one takeaway, is that the modern rationalism is great, and it is so important. And I know it may sound like I'm bashing on it, but I'm bashing on the people who use only that as their main driver for life. And it's like, yes, it's important. Yes, you need it. Yes, you understand. But it doesn't, and some people will probably still find some sort of way to say it does, but it does not explain why, and it doesn't tell you the purpose of, it doesn't tell you the purpose of being. And I think I'm going to wrap it up there, because I will be going on for days if I don't put a halt to this. This is definitely something I'm obviously going to return to, but you should go read The Imp of the Perverse. You can get a book of Edgar Allan Poe's selected works. It's cheap as, it has all of his stories in there. Please get your hands on it. Read some Gothic literature. Look into the Gothic themes. And if you can, find some appreciation for symbols that resonate with you, and try to understand why you resonate and understand and love those symbols specifically. They will serve you a great deal in understanding yourself and why you feel what you feel in those certain settings and symbols. You know, I love fire too. I think fire is unbelievable, and I think it ties well with the fire bearer archetype, which I think I resonate with a little bit. And the characters in the shows that I watch, funnily enough, I love all those characters who are that fire bearer type. I would have never understood why if I didn't really dig into that. I hope you guys enjoyed this 4th episode of Through the Briars pod. I think this was a really good one, and again, this is just a topic that I could never exhaust. There is a whole motif about the dance of death, which I want to do on a separate pod, and the history of that, which is so profound. But I'm going to wrap it up here, and I would like to say thank you for sticking around to the end. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. Utilize the art and myth and story that is around you, that has endured for thousands of years, because they explain truth so profoundly. It's insane. And if you can accompany that with rationality and with logic and with everything else, they serve each other, and they make you a formidable force intellectually, and just when you exist in the world and you understand, it's incredible. Anyway, thank you so much for being here, guys, and I hope you all have a good one. Love.